as we return for our triumphant second season of Johnnie Torch's classic horror reviews. We start off with the first classic from the British Hammer horror studio, Curse of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's novel titled Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus was published in 1818. It became quite popular as a stage play for several years after. Not surprisingly, it was one of the earliest stories to be adapted for the fledgling motion picture studio Edison Studios in 1910. The sound era was still in its infancy when Carl Laemmle's Universal Studios came calling for the Mad Doctor, producing their mega hit Frankenstein directed by James Whale and starring Colin Clive and Boris Karloff as Messrs. Frankenstein, Doctor and Monster, respectively. Across the pond, however, Terence Fisher began directorial duties in a long list of classics for the Hammer Studios beginning in 1957 with The Curse of Frankenstein. Starring the 1-2 punch of Star Wars icons Peter Cushing as the Doctor and Christopher Lee in the role billed in the credits as the Creature. Now, this technically isn't the first time Lee and Cushing were in the same film. Both played in Olivier's Hamlet in 1948, Cushing in the minor role of Ostrich, and Lee as an uncredited spear carrier. The two also appeared in John Huston's Moulin Rouge in 1952. But for all intents, the two began their long association on film here in Curse of Frankenstein. The two would go on to face each other in various Hammer films such as The Mummy, and the equally popular Dracula franchise, as well as Hammer's version of the Sherlock Holmes classic, Hound of the Baskervilles. The Hammer films took full advantage of the use of color, giving us a vivid look at the body parts the Doctor assembles, as well as the stark splash of blood now and again. That, coupled with the slightly more suggestive situations, made the Hammer films stand out from their Universal predecessors, particularly back in 1957. Phil Leakey was tasked with designing the makeup for Lee's Frankenstein monster, which was challenging, since the studio greatly feared a lawsuit from Universal if the monster looked too much like the square-domed version of Karloff, which had already long since seeped into the public consciousness. Eventually, a deal was worked out between Hammer and Universal, and a more conventional-looking monster design was used for one of the film's many sequels, The Evil of Frankenstein. But Leakey's design for Frankenstein was effectively creepy and earned the film's famous tagline, "The Curse of Frankenstein will haunt you forever." As for the film proper, the story opens with the Baron awaiting his execution. During his final hour, he imparts his tale to the visiting Padre. The bulk of the story, then told in flashback, has the young Victor, and yes, unlike the Universal film which renamed the titular protagonist Henry, this film sticks to the book's original name. Young Victor, played by Melvin Hayes, is orphaned and wastes no time hiring himself a tutor, Dr. Paul Crimp. Apparently the young Baron, who is about 15 or so, is less interested in the 3 R's, but in the macabre sciences. The two get on quite well, and flash forward a dozen years or so, and, with Cushing back in the role, Victor and Paul have successfully brought a dog back to life. Coincidentally, it's the only time in the film Cushing's doctor can be heard saying the oft-repeated classic line from Universal's original film, "It's alive." From here, Victor lowers the boom and tells Paul of his plan to create a man and bring him to life. One of the things I like about this version is that the film takes its time to show us some of Victor's history, although it is nearly 50 minutes before we get to see the creature. Another positive is seeing how Victor takes great pains in putting his creature together. Not merely being satisfied with robbing graves for spare parts, Victor must have only the best for his creation, such as the hands of an artist and the brain of a genius. Soon Victor's lovely young cousin Elizabeth moves in, played by Hazel Court, as she and Victor are to be married. And yes, you heard right, I said they were cousins. Hazel would later go on to appear in episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents and The Twilight Zone. Paul wants to back out of the experiment, fearing endangering Elizabeth, and Victor goes to confront him. Oddly, the creature is brought to life by a freak bolt of lightning striking Frankenstein's apparatus. Victor walks in and is greeted by the creature trying to strangle him. I have to point out that the creature's face is revealed by a rapid close-up, not too dissimilar to the 3 quick successive close-ups in the whale version. Eventually, the creature gets loose and Paul shoots him. The pair bury the creature and Paul, thinking that's the end of the movie, moves out. When he returns for Victor and Elizabeth's wedding, he finds the Baron has been at it again, bringing the monster back to life. Although since he was brought to life accidentally the first time, one wonders how Victor managed it this time. The film's ending feels somewhat rushed. Paul leaves to alert the authorities and Victor tries to stop him. Elizabeth, who has been kept completely in the dark about Victor's experiments, wanders down to the laboratory where the creature gets loose yet again. Victor tries to save Elizabeth from him by throwing a lamp at the creature, setting it ablaze, in shades of the classic Universal films where the monster was nearly always vanquished by fire, and he falls into an acid bath, disintegrating him completely. As Victor finishes his tale to the priest, Paul enters and Victor pleads with him to corroborate his story. Paul refuses and leaves with Elizabeth as Victor takes the solemn walk to the gallows. Of course, the good doctor didn't quite get the guillotine, as Cushing returned to the role several times in the franchise, as in the sequels The Revenge of Frankenstein, 1958, The Evil of Frankenstein in 1964, Frankenstein Created Woman in 1967, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in 1969, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell in 1974. Despite a great cast led by Peter Cushing, who's never given a bad performance in his life, and some impressive visuals, I still greatly prefer the Universal version to this one. For one thing, Colin Clive's Frankenstein was not really evil. He might have been a bit egotistical, maybe even unhinged, but he really wasn't a villain. He was a dreamer that got caught up in something too big for any human to deal with, trying to emulate God. But by comparison, in this film, Frankenstein is ruthless. He outright murders a colleague, Professor Bernstein, for his brain, which gets damaged in a struggle with Paul, which is the film's explanation for the creature's malevolent behavior. And he locks his maid/pregnant girlfriend in with the monster as a simple means of getting rid of her. Cushing's Frankenstein is less idealistic and much more the traditional mad scientist whose evil creations further his own ends. And in the same respect, the monster doesn't fare much better. Karloff's monster was a sympathetic one for the most part, but here Lee's creature tends to kill whatever's in front of him. Unlike Karloff's accidental drowning of a little girl, Lee's first introduction to the public is by murdering a helpless old blind man, a character the monster befriended in Universal's Bride of Frankenstein. Apart from a scene where Victor has trained him to sit down on command, one of the few scenes directly lifted from the Universal film, the creature comes across less pitiable. But despite paling by comparison, the film is still a classic, and I'd still recommend it as part of any Halloween viewing. I'm giving The Curse of Frankenstein 3.5 stars out of 5. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.